I'm Catherine and I'm currently the acting director here at the ICS, and it is really an honour to host it here this evening, where John was a director between the years of 2012 to 2014. But it was fair to say that he was always more to the ICS than a director. If you attended the seminars, you'd have appreciated his lively input. If you went to conferences, he was always the one that had people queuing up to chat to him in the coffee break. But he always made time to talk to the most junior of the scholars there, and I benefited enormously from his academic generosity. And in that sense, he was also a role model to many of us at the ICS. So many of you will have spent the day remembering his legacy as a teacher, supervisor, mentor, and colleague. And I'm delighted we can now build on that element, invite this evening's audience to reflect on his enormous contribution to the study of Roman history. In a minute, I will ask Professor Hans van Spies to introduce tonight's speaker. But no welcome is ever complete without two very important bits of housekeeping. Should the fire alarm go off, and I hope it does not, you exit through the back door, turn left through the double doors until you get to the stairs and you make your way down those. Should you need the bathroom facilities, you follow through the exact same set of doors, but you continue past the stairs through the other set of doors, and there you'll find the toilets. Sorry to kick off with that particularly banal introduction, but I am assured that my colleagues here are going to do a much better job of raising the academic bar. So I'll hand over to you now. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hans van Spies, and I'm a Growth Professor of Ancient History at UCL. And it is a great honor and pleasure to be able to chair this final event of the day, in which we have commemorated and celebrated John's life and work. John was a much admired and much loved colleague, friend, supervisor. The list that Catherine already trotted out. I mean, he's been so many things to so many people, and that very much includes me. And I will give you maybe a small example of what he's meant to me before I introduce our speaker, who will talk about John's research more. Sorry, it seems presumptuous, but I do want to make a small contribution to commemoration of John, as well as the bare chairing of this session. And I'm almost embarrassed to make my little contribution, because it really is very small, from anyone's perspective, apart from mine. A very small thing and quite personal. It doesn't even amount to an anecdote, I would say. But it's something that happened a few years after I got my job at UCL. So it was not very well established or long established yet. We had a departmental dinner, and I was ended up sitting opposite John and next to another senior colleague. And I hadn't, given the august company, I hadn't said much for most of the meal. But at some point, I don't know how, I got onto some great TV program I had recently been watching. I want to say The Sopranos, because that's respectable, but it may have been something much lower brow. Anyway, I was gushing, and when I eventually stopped, the other senior colleague said, "Well, that's enough about what's good on TV." I was obviously crushed instantly, especially seeing I'm not someone from let's say, an academic background, so this was a blow. But before I could start kicking myself, John immediately countered, and he said, "If there's one thing wrong with our department, is that we don't talk enough about what's good on TV." And to me, that was not just, the way he said it as well, he meant it. And to me, that was not just a polite, saving of my face, sparing of my blushes, but really, I felt it as a validation of my personality. So, as I said, it meant a lot to me. The fact that I still remember this exchange in a few seconds was literally 25 years later, tells you how much it did mean to me. It is a great illustration for me of John's, not just his kindness, which people have mentioned many times today, but of the empathy that underlies that kindness. as well as, perhaps the more obvious point, the lack of intellectual pretension despite his stellar intellect. So speaking of stellar intellects, as well as wonderful human beings, I'm here primarily to introduce Tim Cornell. Tim is Emeritus Professor of Ancient History at the University of Manchester. Before that, as most people here will know, for many years at UCL in the History Department. Catherine already mentioned his role as Director of the ICS. President also of the Society for the Promotion of Roman Studies. The list goes on. In his scholarship, since Tim was about to talk about John's scholarship, a brief mention of Tim's incredible scholarship, which includes one of the earlier works, pretty much half a volume, was Cambridge Ancient History, which he was the only person who could have written that. Then the quite staggeringly important book, The Beginnings of Rome, which, it's now 30 years old, I think. I'm still using that. I mean, I'm using that in preference to anything more recent for my undergraduate students. It's a wonderful piece of work. And a bit more recently, the 3 volumes of the Fragments of Roman Historians. It's all hugely impressive. I would add that I also have a personal debt to Tim. It's maybe not the occasion to labour that point. But let's just say, if it hadn't been for Tim, Tim's intervention at earlier stages of my career, I wouldn't be chairing the session today. So, over to you. Okay.
Thank you, Hans. I hope everybody can hear me. Good. Just wave your arms if I sort of start fading out of earshot. I was worried that speaking at the end of the day, everybody would already have said everything that I was going to say. And indeed, some aspects, as you will see, have been covered in some sense. But I propose also to include some personal reminiscences of John, my former teacher and colleague, some of which, at least, I have never mentioned to anyone, and which are therefore bound to be new to my audience, unless there are any mind readers out there, or perhaps some species of artificial intelligence that's able to predict my thoughts in advance. But my aim is to ask what it was that made John adopt the approach to Roman religion and Roman culture at various stages in his career. Before moving on to Roman religion, I'd like to have a brief look at a couple of other areas of Roman history to which John made a decisive contribution. Now, on any contested issue, John was always ready to engage. We heard about this earlier, and indeed to plunge into the thick of the battle. And after a lucid, balanced, and open-handed summary of the controversy as he saw it, he would then proceed to offer a new way of approaching the problem, a third way. And it was always an improvement on what had been said before. Every article, chapter, or review discussion started from an examination of the current state of the question, with particular emphasis on revisionist interpretations. In his own specialist field of religion in the Roman Republic, of which he has been dominating figure for nigh on 50 years, John was himself the iconoclast, delivering a series of bombshells that shook the stocking to its foundations, and ensured that it can never be looked at in the same way again. John's article on Roman imperialism in the Journal of Roman Studies in 1981 was ostensibly a reaction to what he saw as the unsatisfactory review of William Harris's book, War and Imperialism in the Republic and Rome, a review by Sherwin White that had appeared the previous year. Now, Harris had attacked the theory of defensive imperialism, the idea, that is, that the growth of the Roman Empire was the accidental result of wars that the Romans had reluctantly fought in defense of their own or their allied interests. They hadn't sought their empire and had acquired it in an absence a fit of absence of mind, in the famous words of J.R. Seeley, who was incidentally one of John's predecessors as professor of history at UCL in the 1860s. As John pointed out, the effect of the defensive imperialism hypothesis was to remove the need for explanation. The wars had just happened, and the empire was their accidental result. What Harris has done, he said, is to restore the problem. John had no difficulty in pointing out that the defensive imperialism theory had been finished off by Harris's onslaught, without hope of recovery, in spite of efforts by the likes of Sherman White to try to revive it. But in his characteristic way, John suggested that both Harris and his critics were asking the wrong questions, and that there are other and more productive ways of examining the issue. Harris had focused too much on specifics at the expense of general issues, and on the Romans' conscious motives and decision-making as against the structural factors of Roman society that underlay the drive towards war and expansion. It's worth saying here that the publication of Harris's book had given rise to animated discussion among London-based ancient historians at our centre in the Institute of Classical Studies, then located in Gordon Square on the top floors of the Institute of Archaeology building, current Institute of Archaeology. Both informally in its tea room and in the regular weekly seminars that Fergus Miller had organised on Thursday afternoons, where John's paper was first aired and discussed among a very interesting group, including Fergus himself, of course, Keith Hopkins, who was an extremely important figure in John's career, Michael Crawford, who came regularly down from Cambridge, Mary Beard, then a lecturer at King's, Sally Humphreys, Emily Court, Avril Cameron, John Carter, and others. One particular theme that emerged from these discussions was the significance of the Roman system of alliances in Italy, that Michael mentioned. And already this point had been made in Michael's book, actually, on the Roman Republic in 1978, which had taken up a suggestion made in a throwaway remark of Mondiano's in Age of Wisdom. But it was John North who articulated the point most clearly in the published version of his paper. First slide. And in this talk, I'm going to be quoting a lot of John speaking himself. There was no tax or tribute, so the resources normally found in taxation could only be realized through the employment of the military potential of the Allies. The non-existence of any requirement to pay tax was clearly part of the working complicity between the Roman oligarchs and their opposite numbers in the Allied communities. Not to have had a war would have meant the remitting of taxes on Italy for a year. War-making was the lifeblood of the Roman population in Italy. The point is so obviously right when stated in these terms, and it's now firmly established as fundamental to understand the growth of the Roman Empire. The article concludes with a statement of what Harris had left out and where future research should be directed. It becomes necessary to change our perspective on all the problems with which war and imperialism deals. The accounts of the origins of the individual wars became relatively unimportant, not in themselves, but for the understanding of Roman imperialism as a historic phenomenon. So the focus of debate can now be shifted towards the far deeper problems of the origin, significance, and eventual disappearance of the expansion-bearing structures in Roman society and organization. I think this is a unique passage because it contains one of the ugliest phrases I've ever come across, namely expansion-bearing structures, which is not at all like John. It's very odd that that should have appeared. But what he meant, of course, was the structures that drove Rome towards imperialism. Another example of a game-changing piece of revisionism, and one that also arose from continuing discussions at UCL and the London Ancient History Seminar, was Fergus Miller's foray into the politics of the Roman Republic, published successively in articles in the Journal of Roman Studies, and eventually in his Jerome lectures in the crowd in Rome in the late Roman Republic. In the opening footnote, we have a reference to this. In his first essay in the Journal of Roman Studies, 1984, Fergus acknowledged this. Whatever I've come to understand about the Roman Republic has been learned from John Northant at Cornell during the last 8 years at University College London. This remains so even though both, like the persons named above, and that is mentioned Peter Brunt, Eric Gruen, Alan Aston, and Mary Beard, might disagree with much that is said here. I would say that in the last line the word might is redundant. Fergus set out to challenge the traditional orthodoxy which held that Roman politics was totally controlled by oligarchic nobility, and that the role of people's assemblies was a sham. What he was aiming at in particular was the prosperographic school, going back to Münzer and Gelzer, but which had established a hold over Anglo-American scholarship, largely through his own teacher and mentor, Ronald Syme, although Fergus was always careful to leave Syme's name out of it. Fergus was not alone. Other scholars were also challenging the consensus orthodoxy that dominated the field for most of the 20th century, particularly in the UK. Brunt, Finlay, Beard and Crawford all had their say. But as usual, it was John who set out the terms of the debate and clarified the issues, especially in 2 articles published in 1990, the past and present article that Valentina was talking about, and Politics and Aristocracy in the Roman Republic, classical philology, which he also mentioned. Now, John outlined the main characteristics of the theory that Roman politics was monopolized by oligarchic factions that controlled the outcome of voting in people's assemblies by patronage and struggled for advantage over rival groups with no regard for the issues at stake, or for the needs or wishes of the voters, or shared political ideas or objectives. In a lapidary statement that has since become famous, John declared, "I shall call this set of views the frozen waste theory of Roman politics." Great. Now, John's choice of past and present for this was, I'm sure, largely due to Keith Hopkins, who is acknowledged as having undermined the idea of the Roman ruling class as a hereditary nobility, thanks to his chapter written with Graham Burton. Hopkins and Burton had suggested that Rome was in no sense a democracy, in contrast to Fergus Miller, who could argue that it had a democratic element that could be compared to that of classical Athens. John, by this point, had grown in confidence to the point where he had no compunction in telling his fellow scholars in print how to conduct their business. Taken together, I should argue that their disagreement suggests that the whole debate is being conducted in the wrong terms. Typical. He agreed with all the revisionists about the need to demolish the frozen waste theory by insisting on the importance of political issues and the vital role of popular assemblies in deciding them. But he moderated this by severely limiting the role of the assemblies, leading to the conclusion that the popular will of the Roman people found expression in the context, and only in the context, of divisions within the oligarchy, as Valentina was explaining. This important reflection was affected by his profoundly pessimistic view of contemporary politics in Britain and the diminished role of democracy within it. His article was written in the aftermath of Margaret Thatcher's third decisive victory in the 1987 election, at a time when he was becoming ever closer to the left wing of the Labour Party. Consider the final words of the article. But at least this thought leads me to observe why this particular topic has been concerning me in the recent past. As always, the contemporary situation sets the historian's agenda. But the comparison goes no further. If the comparison goes no further, then it must be as true now as then that in a competitive situation, concern for the voters' opinions depends on the need to maintain their support. The moment the competition ceases, whether that be the defeat of Antony or of repeated success by one or other side in a two-party system, voters' opinions can all too soon lose their importance to those who are holding power. The thought of Neil Kinnock as a latter-day Mark Antony is By this time, that is the 1990s, John North was at the height of his powers and at the summit of his authority, especially in the field that he'd made his own, the religion of the Roman Republic, and which, as I said, he dominated the best part of half a century. His mature writings on the subject include general surveys for the Cambridge Ancient History, the Einaudi multi-volume Storia di Roma, the contribution on Roman religion from Republic to Principate in Michael Bentley's Companion to Historiography, and the little book Roman Religion, issued by the Classical Association, Surveys in the Classics, which is still by far the best available short introduction to the subject, and above all, in his contribution to the two-volume Religions of Rome, co-authored with Mary Beer and Simon Price. In these and other works, he stated and restated his position, which actually represents a revolution in the subject, namely that we should take Roman religion seriously and on its own terms. This had not been the approach of earlier studies, which had taken a negative, disparaging line that was not much different from the hostile view taken by early Christian sources who had set out to ridicule pagan practices. Modern historians of antiquity, incidentally, notice that they call John the professor of classics, which I think he hated. This is what history of the Roman Empire. Modern historians of antiquity used to argue that roughly from the 6th and 5th century BCE onwards, the inherited religious traditions of the Greek and Roman pagans were becoming an empty shell, maintained by elites who no longer had any faith in them, except as devices for keeping the masses of the cities subservient. In recent decades, this theory, always highly speculative, over-dependent on the views of ancient philosophers, has largely been abandoned by historians of religion. Now, this was written in 2017, at a time when the empty shell theory, as I think we have to call it, was indeed a thing of the past, largely because John had changed the subject forever. The empty shell theory is, of course, reminiscent of the frozen waste theory that we've been talking about, which was a view of Roman political life as a political system with the politics left out. So, too, he was attacking the orthodox view of Roman religion as a religious system with the religion left out. And it was altogether fitting that frozen waste politics had gone together with empty shell religion. The roots of this idea were complex, but depended on the prejudices of modern commentators. First, that the Roman religion we see in the sources for the late Republic and Principate was in a state of advanced and terminal decline. From what must once have been something more vibrant and meaningful in earlier times. Researchers, therefore, this is going back to the late 19th century, set about trying to reconstruct the original authentic religion that had presumably existed at the beginning of Roman history. That was the effort made by Piero da Silva and William Lord Fowler, both writing around about the same time, 1911, 1912. The decline of Roman religion was the result of three processes. Contamination by new cults of foreign, mainly Greek origin. Secondly, the growth of the city and a vast urban population that had gradually lost touch with its rural agricultural roots. And finally, the development of priestly legalism and the reduction of cult practices to a meaningless, empty charade. In his criticism of Ward Fowler, John argued that these three processes exactly reflected the prejudices of an Anglican Oxford don in the Edwardian age. A deep suspicion of foreigners and the threat they represented to native tradition, an anti-modern distaste for the effects of the Industrial Revolution and an arts and crafts type yearning for traditional rural simplicity, and finally a strong anti-Catholic antipathy to repetitive and meaningless ritualism. There was, in fact, a long history of Protestant hostility to priestly ritualism, which ultimately goes back to Luther, but had affected even Monson, who, although an agnostic, had been brought up in the Lutheran tradition and was appalled by the Catholic practices he witnessed when traveling in Italy. And on Monson, John had this to say: And this is from this very important article on religion and the companion to historiography. There can seldom have been a more negative evaluation of the religious system than Mommsen's on Rome. He thought that Romans had an unbelievably low level of understanding of the nature of their own gods and goddesses, that their religion was a matter of dry, everyday formulaic negotiation, that their gods provided no mythology, no art, no inspiration, that after the earliest period, religion was reduced to an empty formalism quite devoid of any interior significance at all. Now, a particular feature of anti-Catholic writing on this subject was the idea that the ritual formalism of its cult practices was a direct inheritance from Rome's pagan past. Consider the pamphlet by the 18th century clergyman Cornell Middleton, who was a fellow of Trinity College and was heavily involved in the conflict with Richard Bentley. After a visit to Rome in the 1720s, he convinced himself that contemporary church ceremonies were of pagan origin. A letter from Rome showing an exact conformity between popery and paganism, or the religion of the present Romans to be derived entirely from that of their heathen ancestors. And the same thing in another pamphlet by Thomas Seward, the rector of Eden in Derbyshire, which is the pagan, written in 1746, of course, on the same theme. Now, these various threads have become interwoven in Ward Fowler's overall picture of the religious experience of the Roman people. It's not hard to see, as John said, at a distance of 80 years, that the problems thus projected onto the Romans in fact had to do with suspicion of the foreign, with a dislike of Catholic ritualism, and with a distaste for the Industrial Revolution of an Anglican Oxford Don, with a well-developed pattern or mythology, which Ward Fowler is also very famous for. Two further aspects to the traditional Orthodox interpretation of Roman religion that prevailed in the first half of the 20th century were, first of all, the evolutionary scheme prompted by contemporary developments in anthropology, which held that the anthropomorphic gods of the Romans had evolved from an earlier stage of natural forces and actions into fully fledged beings with names, personalities, and human characteristics, which was the view of Hermann Usener. This has already been mentioned earlier today, and was a book and a historian who John greatly admired. While Ward Fowler, for his part, drew on the theories of Sir James Frazer and Edward Burnett Tyler to promote the idea, to promote the idea that all religions start with a stage of primitive animism, which in the Roman case was expressed in the worship of noumena, that is, supernatural powers residing in natural phenomena, at what Fowler considered to be a pre-deistic phase in Roman religion. Still, of course, very common in popular culture today. If you look up animism on Google, you'll see there's plenty of it about. The other aspect that goes together with this evolutionary theory is the idea that developed polytheism inexorably changes into monotheism and finally Christianity, which are superior forms of religion, and in the case of Christianity, the ultimately true faith. So the whole thing eventually becomes part of what John called the triumphalist explanation of the rise of Christianity. Indeed, Usener and Ward Fowler were among the great pioneers in using the comparative approach, with notably fertile results at the time. The limitations, however, are also clear enough to us. The framework within which their thoughts were formed was as dominated as ever by the assumption that Judeo-Christian monotheism was the higher form of religion to which their stages of development would finally lead. It followed that polytheism was automatically doomed to failure. The only question was when and how it would fail. Now, in his mature work, John relentlessly attacked this Christianizing orthodoxy to the point where it is now firmly rejected by all serious historians of the subject. But in the 1970s, it was a complete novelty. And it's important to stress that John was the first to take this line in a scholarly publication. It's true enough that others soon joined him. Important books by Wolf Liebeschutz, Alan Wardman, and in France, John Shea, appeared in print in the late 1970s and 80s. But this realization didn't come out of nothing. On the broadest possible canvas, it's worth noting that this was a time when the whole idea of Christianity being at the center of Western history was being challenged. The use of BCE and CE instead of BC and AD had not yet become widespread as it is now, but the idea behind it was very much in the air. In the mid-1970s, members of the Labour government began to advocate reform of religious education in schools, and in particular to argue that religious education should not be taught from a Christian point of view, but should be a neutral study of comparative religions. Part of Jim Callahan's great debate, everybody remembers that in 1976, which was actually designed to protect comprehensive education from right-wing political attacks. But I think it's not an accident that John's assault on Christianizing assumptions in the study of Roman religion should have emerged at this time. It's interesting to observe this forthright approach is not evident in John's earlier De Phil thesis. John's De Phil thesis, which was submitted in 1967, was on the interrelation of state religion and politics in Roman public life in the 2nd century BC. It was over 800 pages long and ran to nearly 200,000 words. In fact, 198,462 words, thanks to good old Microsoft Word. This thesis, incidentally, is available freely on the UCL website, thanks to Jason Davis and Federico Sant'Angelo, who scanned it. It's a detailed and extremely careful account of events in which politics and religion came together in the 2nd century BC. But the radical critique of the then current orthodoxy was only implicit and not openly stated. For instance, Pisova, or Fowler, Latimer, and so on, are merely cited as works of reference, not as targets in any kind of argument. Christianity isn't mentioned at all in reference to the historiography of the subject, or as something that's fatally prejudiced all modern discussions. I searched for texts, it's great, you can do that, isn't it? Found just 3 references to Christians. One where the persecution of the Bacchanalia in 186 BC is compared and contrasted with the later actions taken against the Christians. The other 2 in a discussion of Junius Obsequies, and the question of whether the Liber Prodigiorum, which is a list of prodigies extracted from living, was meant to be making propaganda for or against Christianity in John's side. Not at all obvious whether he's doing either, and therefore clearly was not a propagandist at all. Otherwise, Christianity isn't mentioned, either as part of a historical argument or as a meta-historical element of any theoretical discussion of method or approach. For the most part, the thesis is a classic Oxford De Phil, a positivist, source-based, analytical. There's little theory, no mention of Dumézil, Durkheim, Max Weber, or anyone else. There's no anthropology. Fraser's Golden Bough is mentioned just once in reference to the rebirth of Attis in connection with the Magna Mater card. And Usner's name occurs only as the editor of the Bern Scholia Lucan. There's no historicism and no historiography. There's little sign in the thesis of John North, renowned for his groundbreaking work on the history of Roman religion and ideas, on the interaction between anthropology and history, and on the relationships between ancient history, later historical periods, and the contemporary world, as Antonio Sense says in his excellent tribute on the UCL Sexual and Historical Sciences website. There is undoubtedly a huge change over the period from when John was a De Phil student at Oxford to the mid-1970s, when his main publications first appeared. And I think this calls for some explanation. One obvious possibility is that in the intervening years, he'd come into contact with Modigliani. Of course, that's true, but it's quite hard to assess precisely the effect that the association with Modigliani had on John North. Modigliani appointed him on Weinstock's recommendation to a lectureship in 1963. But from what I can gather, they kept each other at arm's length. And there's little evidence of anything resembling real friendship between them. Modigliani regarded John as a useful member of the teaching staff, but whether he took him seriously as a scholar is more doubtful, though Michael reminded us that John was invited to give no fewer than 3 papers at the Warburg Seminar. You have to remember that in those days, there was no RAE, no ref or equivalent, and no pressure on university staff to publish. And many lecturers and dons ended their careers without publishing anything at all. For as long as Modigliani held the chair of ancient history, John published almost nothing, as far as I can discover, apart from a handful of reviews of books on Roman religion in the JRS, possibly on Modigliani's recommendation. But from my memory, there was little warmth in the relationship, and I suspect that was at least in part because Modigliani did little to encourage John or to engage in serious discussion with him about his work on Roman religion or anything else. Nevertheless, John undoubtedly absorbed a great deal from Modigliani, just from listening to him talk and from his many publications that were coming out in those years. Modigliani publishing in the 60s on early Rome, on Judaism and Christianity, on the conflict between paganism and Christianity, and as ever on ancient and modern historiography. It would be impossible to be exposed to all this and not to be deeply affected. But it had its effect on John's whole approach is beyond doubt, and it's not an accident that when he was organising his thoughts about Roman religion and about ancient history during those years, he was also thinking deeply about what he was doing and why, about his own methodology and the historical development of his own subject. Here I would introduce one interesting footnote. In the world of UCL, University College London, the jointly edited mentioning Hart, we find the famous picture of Modigliani, which is part of the history department's collection. Very nice photograph with that mischievous smile. John always said to me, he looks as if he's about to throw the book at you. And which has the caption, A.D. Modigliani, Professor of Ancient History from 1951 to 1975, whose prodigious writings weave a powerful counterpoint between the ancient world and the modern, between ideas and social reality, between historical problems and their historiography. Now, with all apologies to Nedgley, I think there can be no doubt which of them wrote this. The actual word is, I think, more about John than about Modigliani. Now, I think I'm going to cut a bit here, but I was going to talk about, really? Oh, okay. Okay, as a student at the time, I was an undergraduate in the history department from 1965 to 1968, 8 years. I well remember John teaching us things which later appeared in scholarly articles years, sometimes many years later. We had a weekly reading class where we read passages from ancient historical sources. Aristophanes' account of the causes of the Peloponnesian War and the Acharnians, Polybius on the Roman mixed constitution, Tacitus on the mutiny of the Panamanian legions, and so on. But I distinctly remembered reading the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, the senatorial decree, which was my first ever encounter with archaic Latin, which I found captivating, together with Livy's account of the Bacchanalian affair in Book 39. But much more memorable was John's take on it, later to be published in the essay on religious tolerance in Republican Rome. And the bones of this article were already present and fully articulated in the reading class. In another session, Michael's mentioned this, we pored over Appian's account in Book 1 of the Civil Laws of the chapter about the series of agrarian laws in the 15 years following the death of Gaius Gracchus. At this point in the text, there occurs a very curious reference to a consul called Scipio ordering the demolition of a stone theatre being built by somebody called Lucius Cassius. Now, since the Renaissance, this was thought to be a misplaced reference to an event 50 years earlier, which had somehow crept into Appian's narrative in the wrong place. John, however, pointed out that Scipio was not actually in the text, and I reproduced the apparatus for Gaber's edition. In the manuscripts, it read Caepio or Caepio, and clearly refers to Gaius Servilius Caepio, the consul of 106 BC, that's to say 15 years after the death of Gaius Gracchus, and that Appian is obviously referring to an otherwise unknown event of that year. The whole argument in its full historical context is set out in an article John published in 1992 called Deconstructing Stone Theatres. But for us students, it had already been fully explained in class in 1967. The article's conclusions have now passed into the mainstream. I reproduced the current translation in the Lower Classical Library, the new edition by Brian McGinn, 2020. And there's a note that goes with it. I'll leave you to read the passage itself, but Caepio, you'll see his name is stored. The note, the people involved are Lucius Cassius Longinus, consul 107, Quintus Servilius, Quintus Servilius Caepio, consul 106. There's no need to assume, as editors often have, that Appian has become confused by a similar situation in 154, involving the censor Gaius Cassius Longinus and the consul of the previous year, Publius Cornelius, which is fine. All that's missing is an acknowledgement of the scholar who was responsible for this interesting finding. My point in all this is to say that the long period from 1963 to 1975, when John published very little, was actually crucial for the gestation of his ideas, many of which were formulated at this time but published years, sometimes decades later. It's evident that his first major publication, from 1975 onwards, were the product of careful thought over the preceding 10 to 15 years. To go back briefly to the DeVille thesis, the concluding chapter starts off with what I think is a brief hint at what is to come. It's generally accepted as a truth, Jane Austen, that in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, the state religion in Rome was in decline, its institutions decaying, its priests deprived of their ancient knowledge and art, its significance lost. The educated classes had long since abandoned any belief in the gods of their ancestors, and the whole system was operated by the ruling classes, either for their own political advantage or for the manipulation of society. Okay. At this point, you expect him to put the boot in and to have a go at the Christianizing assumptions of the current orthodoxy and so on. But instead, we get this rather feeble retreat into the state of the evidence. It's far from easy, however, to find any precise evidence in the course of the 2nd century to prove or disprove any of these assertions. Put a little note here saying, how many ancient historians does it take to change our world? Well, the answer, of course, is that we don't know, because there isn't enough evidence. It's a striking coincidence, if that's what it is. John's first major publication came out at the end of 1975, by which time Nominiano had just retired from UCL and was on his way to Chicago. The item in question is a review article discussing Divus Julius, the magnum opus of his former supervisor, Stefan Weinstock, which is published posthumously in 1971. It's very interesting to read the article from the perspective of where John found himself in 1975. It seems to me he was reassessing his whole approach to Roman religion and how it should be studied, and in a way bidding an affectionate farewell to Oxford and the kind of teaching and research that it had represented. Now, on the positive side, the book, Divus Julius, is also a welcome book because it's because studies of Roman religion have tended to fall into rather limited categories, the historical survey from origins onwards, or the detailed study of a particular deity, and to treat of the late Republic, where they treated it before, simply as a period of time. Here we have a study in depth of the religious situation of a crucial period, written on the assumption that Caesar and his contemporaries took their religion seriously, put thought and effort into its administration and reform, and that the historian, whatever he, John, it's 1975, so, but whatever he may make of this activity, has to take it seriously too. And then comes a personal statement with a bit of serious criticism. For those who knew Stephen Weinstock well and remember him with affection and gratitude, the book will always be a very personal reminder of the man in his strengths and his limitations. He believed fervently that the scholar's job was to discover the facts, to establish what our sources can tell us, and to trust their authority. Theories and interpretations would emerge naturally from this exhaustive examination of facts. The criticism or comparison of theories he regarded with the acutest suspicion as tending to the worst of sins, his speculation. Those of his pupils, I wonder who he has in mind, who ventured to ask him broad general questions about the Roman gods, soon found in place but an answer, a fast-growing pile of text, pictures, and dense footnotes at their elbow. His whole approach to scholarship was antipathetic to theorizing, and the arguments of Digus Julius betray this limitation as sure as the presentation of detail proves his deep knowledge of the evidence. The final sentences of the article contain a significant indication of the way John's thoughts were evolving and point to what was soon to come. Of course, the tendency to innovation is one of the most emphatic characteristics of Roman religion, and this seems to be true of almost every period which we can study seriously. It's also one of the least understood or even properly recognized features of the religious history of Rome. Now, I have a thing about the phrase, of course. It looks like an apology to the reader, but it's almost like postmodern quotation marks, you know? For making a point that is tediously familiar to everyone and shouldn't have to be made at all. But it's often disingenuous, as I think it is here. The point being made is not at all obvious or well known, as John himself reveals in the very next sentence. It is also one of the least understood or even properly recognized features of the religious history of Rome. So there's no, of course, about it. And it points directly to the fundamental article of published the following year in the papers of the British School of Rome on conservatism, change of Roman religion. As Mary Beard said in her affectionate tribute to John in the TLS, the column for Don's Life, at the end of May, this was an article that has left its mark on all later research on the subject. It's only 12 pages long, but don't be fooled. John preferred to publish short, penetrating articles rather than big books, and this at least in common with Mondiano. What it did was explore the paradoxical fact that Roman religion, apparently so punctilious and conservative, was at the same time remarkably open to innovation, particularly in the adoption of new deities, cults, and ritual practices. This is normally taken as a sign of the weakness and decline of Roman religion, but it's actually a constant feature of Roman religion as far back as one can go. Again, it's best to put it in John's own words. This hostility of judgment deserves fuller consideration, for its result has been to prevent any historical sympathy with the religious life of the Republic, which has often been treated as a period in which, to all intents and purposes, had no religious life at all, only a series of manipulations, tricks, hypocrisies, and charlatans. So, wonderful figure there. I mean, John was a natural orator, I think. And I do like this figure of the repetition of a series of synonyms, which I understand is called a schisis onomatope. Look it up. Words of varying lengths with words of 5, 1, 4, and 4 syllables, which makes a beautiful artistic composition. In essence, the hostility appears to be the result of a Christianizing standpoint, which has failed to find points of contact with the Roman experience. The two characteristics under discussion, legalism and innovation, represent precisely what is least acceptable to a Christian critic. The legalism evokes the legalism of rabbinical Judaism, which was so forcefully attacked by Jesus Christ himself. The tendency to innovation runs just as foul of Christian exclusivism of the claim there is one truth and one source of divine power. The Romans represent the very antithesis of this position and can expect little sympathy from its adherents. These two sentences are extraordinary. Although we now take these ideas for granted, largely because of John's life work, it's important to remember that this had never been said before. Mary Beard is right, she usually is, this was absolutely revolutionary. John made two further points. Within the modern world, we're used to religion being separated from politics, everyday social life and culture. But in the ancient city-state, it was completely embedded in all aspects of community activity. And secondly, that religions, and this may well be true of all religions, in some sense reflect the societies that produce them. To reproduce the actual passage. Once one has adopted a less hostile stance, it becomes possible to find new perspectives on the historical process, which may in the long run be more illuminating. It seems that the religion of the Romans in particular is distorted by being removed from its social and economic context and treated in sterilized abstraction. The tradition of innovation looks totally mysterious and un-Roman, taken in isolation. That's point one. Now for point two. Let us make the assumption that the divine community is in a very real sense a projection of the human community. One of the most familiar facts about the history of the early and Middle Republic is the consistent Roman policy of opening her community to new and foreign citizens. Throughout the 3rd century, this policy moves steadily onwards. Communities, as they are conquered, move through successive stages until they attain the rank of Res Romani. Now, the novelty of this comment is, I think, twofold. It's not just the idea that Roman religion was a reflection of society in that it was open to innovation and willing to admit newcomers. It's equally the suggestion that early Roman society was like that. And this was by no means common currency in the 1970s. It was only at that period that people began to realize how the effects of Greek culture were having on the Roman community, for instance, a very deep process of Hellenism, which goes right back before 600 BC. And it was only in 1971 that Cornell Ampelo pointed out that the archaic society of Central Italy in the 6th century BC practiced what he called horizontal social mobility, which is not what it necessarily sounds like, but refers to the fact that was revealed, thanks to Ampelo's very careful and decisive research, by a combination of literary, archaeological, and ethnographic evidence, that persons and groups at all social levels could move freely from one community to another and take up residence there, and across linguistic and ethnic boundaries without loss of social position. Rome at this stage, Ampelo said, was una città aperta, an open city. This situation was reflected in its myths and legends. Most of its 7 kings were outsiders of foreign origin. At the foundation of the city, Romulus established its population by opening an asylum and inviting all comers, including homeless vagrants, asylum seekers, and significantly, runaway slaves. These were the original Roman people. Romulus's distant ancestor, Aeneas, and his Trojan followers were refugees fleeing from a war zone at the other end of the Mediterranean. And in historical times, Rome was a dynamic and constantly changing society with a growing population, thanks to the incorporation of conquered peoples and the importation of slaves, many of whom were freed and became Roman citizens on manumission, which was a Roman peculiarity that shocked Greek observers. By the time of Nero, all Romans were descended, at least in some degree, from slaves, and they all knew it. And their loving, preserved myths and historical traditions are celebrated. And here's a further quotation. It's one of the extraordinary features of Roman life that this process of Romanization is not impeded, so far as we can see, by any strongly developed prejudice against the extension of the citizen community or against the new citizens themselves. It seems hardly possible or sensible to separate the deeply rooted Roman tradition of having open boundaries to new gods from the policy of having open boundaries to new Roman citizens. The one is the projection onto the symbolic level of the social reality of the other. That, of course, explains my title. So in his article on conservatism and change, John was saying something new, not only about Rome's embrace of religious novelty, but also about the social reality that was projecting it. And all this in the wider context of a revolutionary approach to the whole subject. In one sense, it's amazing that it was John's first major journal article, but it's obvious that he didn't jump in full armour from the head of Jupiter. He was nearly 40 years old, and it's obvious that a great deal changed since his days as Weinstock's deep student at Oxford. Now, I've tried to fill in some of the background to this change, and I've offered a couple of thoughts. For instance, his increasing commitment to Liberal politics and the influence of Montaigne. His later article on Roman religion in the Companion to Historiography, from which I've quoted frequently in his talk, is a masterpiece of its kind, and is in a way pure Montaigne, at least in its method and approach. Even so, Montaigne, I'm sure, would not have accepted his main arguments. Mon, in his later articles, continued to presuppose that Judeo-Christian monotheism was a superior form of religious belief, and that the pagan Romans accepted, if they did not invent, the separation of religio from other aspects of life, and recognized a contrast between sacrum and profanum. Something is missing from the story I'm telling, and I think I know what it is. It's hard to describe, for those of my advanced age, hard to remember, the extraordinary hold exercised by the established Anglican Church on all aspects of British life and culture in the first half of the 20th century. Its institutions, social, economic, legal, medical, and educational, were dominated by it. Remember how it was impossible to do anything on a Sunday. And particularly the university, as Sir Humphrey would say, both of them, and, but actually Oxford and Cambridge were drenched in established religion. And my own experience of a strict Church of England boarding school was of a sort of cloying, Edwardian, suffocating Anglican religiosity, which I suspect may have been part of John's experience at Oxford. I can certainly recognise the same feelings in his treatment, quite possibly unfair treatment, actually, of the father. But what made a huge difference to John, as indeed it did to me, was arriving in Gower Street. For me, going up to UCL was a Damascene journey. And for John, UCL, we've heard today so much about his attachment to the college, to its tradition. I remember we were told on my first day at college by then Provost Sir Ivor Evans that University College has a proud and honourable tradition of having no proud and honourable traditions. And, okay, it was not an atheist institution. Quite the contrary, it was a free-thinking institution in the most literal sense. And what distinguished it, and this is what we get in history by mentioning John, was the fact that it was prepared to admit students who were Jews, Roman Catholics, non-conformists, atheists on an equal basis. Now, this wasn't religious toleration, which was what was maybe being practiced in contemporary Oxford, where such people were at last being admitted were sort of, as it were, on sufferance. John understood very well that you can't have toleration without preceding phase of intolerance. Like so many of these religious concepts, you can't have pagans without Christians, because paganism, pagans are people who are not Christian, so on. And you can't have heresy without orthodoxy, and so on. So too, toleration only makes sense in relation to intolerance. And what was unique about University College is that all were welcomed equally, and whatever beliefs you had, you were treated equally seriously and with equal respect, which is a very, very different attitude. I think John was deeply affected by that, and I'm sure it had an influence on the way he examined working religion and realized that there was this Christianizing assumption that was changing everything. And we might, this is the final thing I'm taking it from this Religious History of the Roman Empire article again. We might call this a form of toleration, but it's toleration rooted in indifference, not in principle. Pagan observers might see the customs of their neighbours as weird or eccentric, but rarely as wrong or wicked. If they did see a good reason to condemn a particular religious practice, they felt no compunction based on principle to abstain from banning or expelling the practice. That's a reference to the Bacchanalia, which the Romans very firmly stamped on in 186 BC. So it's not a question of banning of all, sorry, let me rephrase this. It's the point of abstaining from banning, the point of principle that the centralized, unique religion, exclusive religion, makes a positive decision to abstain from banning or persecuting people who have false beliefs. And that was obviously the opposite of the spirit of University College, which I think really deeply affected John. So there's a big contrast, I think, between the view from Gower Street and what you could see from the Turl or Baha.